my family sat around my uncle's dining room table and held an actual vote on whether my inheritance should go to my brother instead of me. And they did this with a show of hands, like it was a neighborhood association meeting and not a legally binding document my father had signed 11 years before he died, and 7 hands went up in favor of giving Marcus my portion. And I sat at the end of that table, and I did not raise my hand for either option because I was not voting, I was watching. And 3 weeks later, I stood in front of the same 11 people at my grandmother's 80th birthday party with a folder in my hands. And I said before we cut the cake, I think everyone should see what I found. And I opened the folder, and what was inside that folder ended the vote permanently and ended several other things along with it. Because what my family did not know when they held their little dining room election was that I had spent those 3 weeks talking to my father's estate attorney and learning some things about my brother Marcus that were going to make the conversation about inheritance feel very small by comparison. Hi everyone, welcome back. And listen, if you are new to this channel, today you are getting one of the more layered stories I have ever told, because this is not really about money. It ends up being about something much more specific. My name is Diane Castellano, and I am 38 years old, and my father died 14 months ago and left a will that divided his estate equally between my brother Marcus and me, which is exactly 50% each, and the will was clear, and it was notarized, and it was not ambiguous in any way, and 3 months after the funeral, my extended family decided that the will was, in their words, not really reflecting what Dad would have wanted, and they organized what they called a family conversation about it, and the family conversation turned out to be a vote held in my Uncle Gerald's dining room with 11 relatives present and the proposal on the table, which Gerald had apparently been workshopping with several family members over group texts I was not included in, was that I should voluntarily reduce my inheritance share because Marcus had 3 kids and I did not, and because Marcus had recently lost his job and I was, in Gerald's words, doing just fine on your own. I want to walk through exactly how that dining room conversation went, because the specifics matter, and the specifics are what made the next 3 weeks necessary. And Gerald opened by saying we wanted to have an honest family conversation about fairness. And I said, Gerald, the will already determined fairness. It's 50-50. And Gerald said legally yes, but morally there's more to consider. And I said, what does that mean? And my Aunt Patricia said Marcus has 3 children to provide for Diane. You're single. And I said that has nothing to do with what Dad decided, and my cousin Will said Dad probably would have updated the will if he'd had more time, and I said the will is 11 years. Old Will. He had plenty of time. And Gerald said we just think as a family, we should discuss whether the original split still makes sense. And I said, the original split is a legal document, not a discussion topic. And Gerald said, well, we'd like to put it to the family. And I said, you can't vote on someone else's inheritance. Gerald, that's not how wills work. And Gerald said, we're not voting on the legal document. We're voting on what we think the right thing to do is. And then he actually called for a show of hands, and 7 people raised their hands in favor of me reducing my share. And I sat there and I looked at 7 raised hands belonging to people who had no legal standing whatsoever in my father's estate. And I said, okay, and I left. What none of those 7 people knew, including Marcus, was that I had been quietly aware for several months of something Marcus had specifically asked me not to tell anyone, and the something was this. Marcus had not actually lost his job the way the family believed he had lost his job, and Marcus had been terminated for cause after an internal investigation found he had been falsifying expense reports for over a year, and Marcus had told the family a softened version, which was that the company had downsized his position. And I had known the real version because Marcus had called me himself 2 months before the family dining room vote and told me everything and asked me to keep it quiet because he was embarrassed and because he was trying to find new work without that history following him, and I had agreed to keep it quiet because I genuinely believed in privacy around someone's worst professional moment, and I had kept that promise faithfully right up until Marcus stood in his own defense at Gerald's table and let 7 family members vote to reduce my inheritance, partly on the premise that he had been unfairly downsized through no fault of his own. And I sat there and listened to Patricia describe Marcus's job loss as such bad luck, and I thought about the real version sitting in my phone, and I made a decision that I want to be honest about, which was not vindictive. In its origin, it was simply that I was no longer willing to let a false narrative about Marcus's hardship be used. As leverage against a legal document my father had signed with full clarity of mind, I spent the next 3 weeks doing two things. And I want to be precise about both, because precision matters in a story like this one, and the first thing I did was contact my father's estate attorney, a careful man named Mr. Okonjo who had handled the will for over a decade, and I asked him directly whether a family vote of any kind had any legal bearing on the distribution of the estate, and he said absolutely none. Diane, the will stands exactly as written regardless of family opinion, and I asked him to put that in writing for my own records, and he did. And the second thing I did was simply decide that I was done protecting a story that was being used dishonestly to pressure me. And I called Marcus directly before I did anything public, and I said, Marcus, I need you to either tell the family the truth about your job or I will. And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, why would you do that to me? And I said, because you let them use a lie to pressure me out of half of what Dad left me. And that's not something I'm willing to carry quietly anymore. And he said, give me time. And I said, I gave you 2 months. Marcus, I'm giving you 3 weeks now. The 3 weeks passed. And Marcus said nothing to anyone, and at my grandmother's 80th birthday party, with all 11 relatives present, including Gerald and Patricia and Will, I stood up before the cake was cut, and I said, I want to share something before we celebrate Grandma. And I opened the folder which contained Mr. Okonjo's written confirmation that the will stood exactly as written with no legal bearing from any family vote, and a printed copy of the termination letter Marcus had shown me himself 2 months earlier, when he asked me to keep it quiet, and I read both documents out loud calmly and without embellishment. And I said, 3 weeks ago, several of you voted on whether I should give up part of my legal inheritance, and I want you to know 2 things, which are that legally that vote means nothing, and the reason given for that vote, which was that Marcus had been unfairly downsized, was not accurate, and the room went completely silent, and Marcus stood up and said, Diane, and I said, I gave you 3 weeks, Marcus. And he sat back down, and Patricia said, is this true, Marcus? And Marcus did not answer, and his silence answered for him, and Gerald looked at the floor and my grandmother, who was 80 years old and had said almost nothing through the entire ordeal, looked at me and then looked at Marcus and then said, well, now we know, and we cut the cake. I did not reduce my inheritance, and the estate distributed exactly as my father had written it 11 years earlier, and Marcus and I have spoken twice since that birthday party, both times briefly, and both times about logistics. And Gerald sent me a text 2 weeks later that said, I'm sorry we put you in that position. And I said, I appreciate you saying that, Gerald. And that was the extent of our conversation about it, and I think about that dining room vote sometimes, and I think about 7 raised hands belonging to people who believed they had standing in a decision my father made alone 11 years before any of them organized a meeting about it. And I think the lesson in all of this is not really about money. It is about what happens when people borrow someone else's hardship to build leverage against, a fact they do not like. And I was willing to protect Marcus's privacy indefinitely, right up until his privacy became a weapon pointed at me. And once it became that, I stopped protecting it, and I do not regret the decision, even though I understand. It changed something permanently between Marcus and me that may never fully repair, and some things, once spoken into a room full of family, simply cannot be unspoken, and I think my father, who wrote that will with complete clarity 11 years before any of this happened, would understand exactly why I opened that folder.